Greetings, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. So I'm in front of the bust of John Donne near St Paul's Cathedral in London. And it's a cathedral with which he had a close association, ending his life whilst he was dean of the cathedral. Sorry, when I say ending his life, I don't mean he committed suicide. He didn't. He died of an illness. At the end of his life, he was the dean. Forgive me, it was badly phrased. So Donne was born here in London in 1572, and his family were Roman Catholics. The Catholic minority was severely persecuted at the time. He was of Welsh extraction on his father's side. That was that. And when when John Donne was 4, his father passed away. So the family grew up in rather straitened circumstances. His mother married another Catholic man, a Mr. Haywood, but nonetheless they were a middle-class family. And they had a distinguished ancestor, because John Donne was the great-great-nephew of Thomas More, the Catholic saint who'd been Lord Chancellor, the author of Utopia and so on, and an outstanding Renaissance man, friend of Erasmus and so on. And so Donne was a multi-talented person, and he seems to be gifted with the same literary aptitude that his great-great-uncle had at the time of Henry VIII. So what else about Donne? Anyway, he went to Hart Hall, Oxford, at the age of only 11. Now, I know people went to university earlier in those days because there was less to learn and the lifespan was shorter, but that was still extraordinary. 14 wouldn't have been that unusual. Anyway, so Hart Hall has since been changed into Hertford College, Oxford, but in those days Hart Hall was some sort of annex of Magdalen College. Anyway, so after 3 years he moved on to Cambridge University. He did not gain a degree from either university, though by all accounts he was a diligent student, passionate about learning, but he refused to subscribe to the oath of supremacy, as in he wouldn't swear that he believed the monarch was the head of the church, because in his heart of hearts he was a Catholic, and he said obviously the Pope is the head of the Church. The Church of England isn't the proper one. But he seems to have compromised his principles a bit later. He later went to Tavies Inn, which no longer exists, one of the inns of court, as in you could study there for a year or so, and that was generally recognised. You knew enough about the law, and you would be called to the bar, as in qualify as a barrister, a lawyer. There were no exams as such until the mid-19th century. And that obviously involved an oath of supremacy. So by his early 20s, he was willing to bend his principles, but he'd had a very hand-to-mouth existence up until that point. So he tried to make his way as a writer more than a lawyer. The law didn't appeal to him very much. He also translated a lot from Latin, because of course education was mostly through Latin and ancient Greek. He knew a great deal about theology. He's best known as a writer, as a poet, part of the metaphysical poets, composing many sonnets, but moving on from the Petrarchan sonnet to his own style. Very witty, using a lot of double entendre and things like that. And he liked to weave his themes together, rather everyday, even scatological themes, with ones which are spiritual and lofty. So he liked a lot of bathos in his poetry. One of his most famous lines, though, is "Ask not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." For Whom the Bell Tolls obviously inspires Ernest Hemingway's novel, or what's the, just to remember the other very famous one by him, "No man is an island entire of himself." Okay, so we're not cut off, we can't be atomized, we all have to interact. Someone else's death diminishes me, because, we're all part of mankind. What else about Donne? So he married in secret a lady, a Miss Moore. I wonder if she was also related to Thomas More. Sorry, I should say More, M-O-R-E, with a single O, so Thomas More. With a double O, Moore is the Irish poet. So More is English and Moore is Irish, but he's more and more and more, okay? The English chap. So what else about him? Anyway, he was a civil servant by this stage, working at York House, which no longer exists, by the Embankment Gardens, so it was the Archbishop of York's house in London under Sir Thomas Egerton. And Egerton was irate when he discovered that Donne had married without his say-so, and indeed he was flung into Fleet Prison. After a few months, he was set at liberty. So he had a happy marriage, very happy. In fact, so happy they had 12 children in about as many years. So, he'd been thrown out of his situation, so he was almost an impecunious party, as barristers would say, and didn't seem to prosper in the law because people knew that he wasn't committed to that. His heart wasn't in it. So he had to rely on handouts from affluent friends and those who enjoyed his witty conversation and his sparkling prose. But anyway, he was finally told that he ought to be ordained, and he reluctantly did it just to please the king. He was made a priest in the Church of England. And remember, up to this time, and even in the 17th century, almost any learned man you've ever heard of was a clergyman. He was also elected to Parliament, I forget for which constituency. Don't forget that until the 1780s, there would seem to be no contradiction between being a clergyman and being a politician. It's only Horne Tooke changed that when the law was passed disbarring anyone in holy orders from entering the House of Commons. So that was that. He fell gravely ill in 1731, and he rose from his sickbed to deliver this renowned sermon about the duel, the duel that is death. And it was almost as his own funeral sermon he was conducting. He died just a few days later. So that's him, a contemporary of Shakespeare. I'm not aware if they ever met, actually, but one of the most celebrated figures in English literature. And this bust was put up only in 2012 in the shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral. There it is. So when he was Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral towards the end of his life, he was doing quite well because this was more or less a sinecure and carried a handsome salary with it. Dean is a sort of administrative position in the cathedral. I don't quite understand precisely what the duties were, but in those days I'm told they were not unduly onerous. All right, that is enough about John Donne.